This Sunday will mark the one-year anniversary of the beginning of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And a year on, that disaster continues to devastate the people and the nation of Japan. Towns and cities within miles of the Fukushima plant are still covered in a fine layer of radioactive dust and have been turned into a nuclear wasteland devoid of life. Those lucky enough to have survived the earthquake and tsunami are now battling radiation poisoning and the probability of cancer and birth defects. As hundreds of thousands of people across the world prepare to commemorate the tragedy over the course of the next month, we need to ask ourselves, is nuclear power really worth enduring such a horrible and deadly disaster? Will there ever be a way to make nuclear power a safe form of energy? Or do we need to move away from it altogether? Tonight we have a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds featuring Stephanie Cooke. Stephanie is one of the world's top reporters and authors on the issue of nuclear energy and the use and history of nuclear weapons, and is a real industry insider. Her articles on nuclear topics have appeared in a variety of publications, including Reader's Digest, the International Herald Tribune, and GQ magazine. Stephanie first began her reporting career in 1977 at the Associated Press, and later moved to London, where she covered the Chernobyl disaster for Business Week. She returned to the United States in 2004 to complete her most recent book, In Mortal Hands, a cautionary history of the nuclear age. Currently, Stephanie is the editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, part of the Energy Intelligence Group. Stephanie, brilliant book, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have us with you. I'm curious, just at a personal level, what sparked your interest in nuclear issues that took you to the point where you've become one of the experts around the world on this, at least from a repertorial point of view?
Well, if I go way back to when I started in 1980, I was at a conference in Mexico City on nonproliferation when I hardly understood the meaning of the word, let alone being able to pronounce it. And I met a Frenchman called Bertrand Goldschmidt, who was one of the distinguished guests, surrounded by acolytes, and he invited me to sit next to him at lunch, much to the chagrin of all the people that surrounded him, because I was sort of a little nobody. But I asked him, thinking, what should I ask this man? I said, well, how did you get into this business? And he said, I separated radium isotopes for Marie Curie. And right away, my hair stood on end, because, of course, I had read about her and her discovery of radium and how she'd...
And her hands rotting off.
And her... Well, as a child, you don't read this in children's biographies. She was a heroine of mine. Yeah. Not so much now, after I read grown-up biographies of her when I was researching my book. Yeah, she lost a child at 5 months, a baby, and her daughter died of radiation poisoning, as did she. But... I thought, my goodness, when you're growing up and you're reading about people like Marie Curie, you're thinking they're so far back in the past, and here you're sitting next to a man who actually knew her. Right. Because she only died in 1934. So that was one thing. And then the other was talking to a man at that conference. I took him aside and I said, by the way, mostly men were at these conferences. Sure. So I was sort of the odd person out, plus I was young then. So anyway, I said to this man, what's this all about? And he said, we're talking about the war and peace issues of our day. And I said, that's interesting. And so, it sort of planted a seed, I think. I still was on a steep learning curve. I thought reactors were reactors and bombs were bombs. I didn't understand that there was a relationship between the two, and a very close one.
Well, what is that relationship?
Well, that's a whole separate area that I got into and that I learned as I went along, which is that the fuel cycle, which is starting from uranium in the ground to processing it and then putting it through an enrichment plant like the kind they have in Iran, is necessary to produce the fuel you need for a power reactor, but it's also the process that you go through in order to produce fuel for weapons. You can use an enrichment plant to produce weapons for a highly enriched uranium bomb. And then if you put the fuel in a reactor and irradiate it and then take it out and put it in a chemical separation plant called a reprocessing plant, you get plutonium, and then you have a plutonium bomb. Wow. But for a minute, getting back to this conference and the appeal of nuclear, it wasn't the industry, it wasn't the business end of it. It was that I sensed even then that there was this enormous secrecy surrounding everything. People were very reluctant to tell me anything. And there was also this sort of a feeling of zealotry. And I remember in particular this one man near Mr. Goldschmidt, whose name was incongruously Andre Petit, because he was very tall, who would wax on about plutonium, which I hardly understood what that was either. But the way he said plutonium, almost in religious tones, I was mesmerized. I would just sit there listening to him, waiting for him to pronounce it again so I could hear him say it. But I thought, what is this? And I thought I must be imagining it. But as more time went on, I realized that there really is a kind of mythical aspect to nuclear energy on both sides. There's a mythical aspect on the civilian side, with people thinking it was going to be the answer to all our problems. It was going to solve the world's energy problems. And on the weapons side, it's even more alluring. It's the power, it's the incontrovertible power that you know, you will be the one that controls the world. This is what people sort of dreamed of. This is why Saddam Hussein did what he did. This is why Gaddafi did what he did. And why the North Koreans are making their people starve so they can have nuclear weapons. It's very, very powerful. So all of this becomes kind of, yeah, it becomes sort of magnetizing, not in a very good way, not in a very positive way, but you want to explore and you want to find out more. So this leads on to...
I interviewed somebody some years ago who knew Edward Teller.
Wow.
And who suggested that the whole Atoms for Peace thing came out of this wrenching guilt that these men felt who had been involved in the Manhattan Project because they had vaporized several 100,000 people in Japan, or the product of their work. And the only way that they felt they could redeem themselves, some consciously, some unconsciously, but this was the thread that seemed to run through it, was by using this technology to save lives, to create power that could power hospitals.
Yes.
You know, radiation in medicine, things like that. Is that your sense of it? And if so, has that been lost and it's just been turned into a business? And if so, has it been turned into a toxic business?
There's an element of that still. It's fed through the industry's, well, how they advertise themselves and how they put themselves forward. You still hear this, that it's clean energy, that it's going to save the...
Is it?
No. That's a myth. It's been created by more by advertising people. But the Atoms for Peace is more complicated than that. There definitely was guilt, and there was always a dream, by the way, going back to Marie Curie's time, that if you could tap into this energy, which really was an amazing discovery, you could have all these wonderful peaceful uses. They didn't really understand where you would go with this, but there was always the dream that this would be beneficial to mankind. And you know, there are a lot of well-meaning people, and always have been in the nuclear industry.
It's kind of Icarus-like, though, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I say that with you know, some of them are, not all of them. But once the weapon, really the origins of Atoms for Peace under Eisenhower was a need to find a happy message to give the public while you increased your weapons stockpile. And it was really a PR campaign from top to bottom, where they got a man from Time Life who was in PSYOPs operations during the war. They fanned out to all the media and used it, you know, unabashedly to promote the idea of peaceful nuclear energy. And everything flowed from there. This is a very, very, and you know, by the way, all the language that you hear associated with so-called peaceful nuclear energy, it used to be, Oppenheimer called it either dangerous nuclear activities or safe, and he made a distinction. That wording was dropped for obvious reasons, and then now they go to peaceful, or you know.
I remember as a kid, the power company in Lansing, Michigan, you know, they had a nuke someplace in Michigan that they actually a couple of them, Fermi and one up in Charlevoix. And we were told, this was in the 50s and early 60s, we were told that eventually, within a decade or so, our electricity would be free. And every couple months, we'd gather up all the light bulbs in the house and take them down to the power company, and they'd exchange them for free.
Wow.
You know, we'd give free light bulbs, because eventually electricity is going to be free. And, you know, you need to use more electricity. And What happened to that? I mean, it's like...
I must say I never had that experience. Well, it certainly didn't prove too cheap to meter. And that quote, by the way, was, it will one day, one day it will prove too cheap to meter. It's never proven too cheap to meter. In fact, now the reason that the Renaissance in the United States isn't taking off is partly because we have an abundance of natural gas, but it's just pricing itself out of the market.
Nuclear power.
Yeah, it's costing somewhere between $6 and $10 billion a plant, and you know, utility men are not stupid. They don't want. I mean, they know, they understand. There's a lot of hassle factor associated with nuclear energy. Some of them are still very much for it, and we do have one project proceeding in Georgia, paid for by the ratepayers ahead of the plant being built.
Yeah.
But.
Slick way to cover the downside.
It didn't used to be allowed because you know they have no guarantee they will get the money back if the plant for some reason is never built and never produces any power. I mean, normally the way utilities operate is you don't pay ahead, you pay for what you get.
Yeah. And the Germans looked at this and they wanted not to build a couple more nuclear plants, and so they did the solar panel thing and thought, you know, let's generate a gigawatt or 2 gigawatts, a couple of nuclear power plants. They've generated 10 nuclear power plants worth of solar power now.
Exactly. The Germans, it's a very, very interesting situation going on in Europe. My colleague at NIW has just written about it this week, so I've just come fresh from editing his story. But Germany is not only very vociferously anti-nuclear in its own country, it's now pushing other countries around its borders to not do nuclear, including France and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and saying, you know, we're on your border. If you have an accident, we get hurt by this.
I lived there when Chernobyl happened.
Right, and you know, it isn't just about Fukushima.
Yeah.
It's Fukushima plus Chernobyl, because the whole European landmass, and I was living in England at the time, got, you know, there were pockets, very high pockets all over Europe. When I wrote the book, the northwest of England still had farms under quarantine from Chernobyl. So this left a strong impression, I think, particularly the Germans.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable, and you know how this, you know. Well, let's talk about how this is going to play out.
Sure.
We'll be right back. After the break, more of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Stephanie Cooke. Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm joined by Stephanie Cooke, an expert on nuclear energy and the use of nuclear weapons, and the author of In Mortal Hands, A Cautionary History of the Nuclear Age. Stephanie, what provoked you, or what motivated you? I asked earlier what got your interest in nuclear power and nuclear weapons. That was a fascinating story. Why this book now?
Well, I'll tell you the actual trigger for the book was what was going on with the first Gulf War in 1991. And I felt very frustrated in the ensuing years that people were expressing so much surprise that we discovered this huge weapons program in Iraq, and that the Made in USA stamp was on some of the equipment we were finding. There was a lot of stuff that had come from Europe, and this was a result of our close relationship with the Iraqis during the 80s and our willingness to look the other way when there were questionable dual-use exports and so on and so forth. But you know, there's only so many times you can explain this to people at dinner parties or whatever, so you sort of say, well, you know, and I had one very good friend in London who'd written a book about Oppenheimer, about the moral, a novel called America's Children. It's a very, very good novel about his moral conflict, and we talked endlessly about it, and he said, you know, you've got to write about this. People don't understand this. You've got to write about the relationship, because all of this flows out of the trade in the civilian nuclear industry, the fact that he has got all this stuff, and that we had, you know, Pakistan going nuclear and several other countries. And but then as I got into the book and I thought more about it, I thought, you know, how will I do this? And I thought I have to write about the relationship between the military and civilian sides of nuclear power, because they're very inextricably linked, and they're linked through the fuel cycle, as I think I explained earlier.
Now, if I may,
yeah.
We talked about enrichment. My understanding is that you have to enrich uranium up to around 3% for a nuclear power plant and over 90% for a bomb. Yeah. That's a real significant difference. Is the fuel cycle different for the two?
No.
How quickly interchangeable is it?
No, you just reconfigure the plant and just You just run it through more times, to put it simply.
Just spin 'em
You use the same equipment. It's the exact same equipment. It's the same technology. You just reconfigure it differently. And it doesn't take that long to do it. But the other thing that was a kind of big elephant in the room for me is that I always felt this talking to people about nonproliferation policy during the 80s. Especially I had a conversation with somebody from India who said, well, do you think it's fair that you have nuclear weapons? And I never thought about that. I just thought, well, we have them and that's the way the world is and we're the big cat on the block and that's it. But actually, the more I thought of it, the more I thought we have never discussed in this country, in my lifetime, we have never had a serious national conversation about our relationship to this whole enterprise, to the whole nuclear thing, not just civilian nuclear power, but our weapons establishment, which in 1996, the authors of Atomic Audit said had cost us $5.5 trillion, and is going to cost us something like $175 billion over the next 10 years. I mean, I was at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock Symposium earlier this year, and there was a wonderful speaker who I'm sure you've heard of called Elaine Scarry, and she pointed out something that really sort of blew my mind. She said, you know, we have 14 Ohio-class nuclear submarines, each of which has enough firepower to decimate a continent. And I checked this, and I believe she's right. There's only 7 continents.
Right.
How much do we need?
And there's only 6 that are occupied.
Right,
I mean,
right, exactly.
More than
Good
a few
point.
dozen people.
You'd need an icebreaker for the others, right?
Yeah.
So this is scary, and accidents happen. Maybe accidents are happening as we speak on these that we've never heard of. We don't know, you know. We do know that there's been multiple accidents of Strategic Air Command planes in the air, mid-flight collisions, where they have, and they only carry thermonuclear weapons, as far as I know.
So we have nuclear bombs in the air all the time?
I don't know whether we still have them in all the time, but in the 1980s, there was an incident, I believe it was the 1980s, over Palomares, Spain, a very famous incident where we were refueling in flight and the planes caught fire and the 4 bombs dropped to the ground. This happened again in Greenland and Thule. This has happened more than a dozen times.
Wow.
Where these kind of accidents happened. For a while they couldn't find one of the bombs. But anyway, there was radiation spread all over the ground around this poor little village in Spain, and massive cleanup and massive secrecy. Yeah, but they just scattered some of the stuff that was around it. It wasn't like a nuclear explosion, but they scattered the contents of some of the stuff around. So there had to be a cleanup, and this wasn't. But the thing is, apart from wanting the public to know about this, apart from hoping this book would get traction, would become a focal point for discussion about these issues, because they are complicated. I wanted to make it accessible and easy for people to read and understand and grapple with.
And it is, you've done that.
Thank you. But I wanted to talk about this relationship between the two sides, and I wanted to talk about the secrecy and the zealotry, and I wanted to talk about you know, where we go from here, can we get to zero? Is that, you know, are we as a country somebody who wants to be represented, that this is our way of defending ourselves, that we carry around this capability for planetary destruction? I have a real problem with this. I have a real problem that we go to the international courts and combat efforts to declare nuclear weapons illegal and immoral and against all concepts of human rights, because they are, after all, weapons of mass destruction. And the more we keep them here and use them as the bar that anybody else has to reach to be as powerful as we have, as long as we have them, we send that message to the rest of the world. How can we not expect other countries to want to get there too?
You know, there was that moment when Ronald Reagan, and some have suggested this was his early Alzheimer's, when he sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev and said, let's just go to zero.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev said, cool, let's do it. And it was like, we almost got there.
Yeah.
And then
SDI got in the way.
Yeah, a whole bunch of things got in the way. But yeah, Star Wars in particular. And what's it going to take?
It's going to take a tremendous amount of courage, but most of all, it's going to take public awareness. I think that the public in the United States to the extent they ever think about nuclear weapons, which why would you? It's kind of an uncomfortable area to go to.
Right.
You sort of have a vague sense that maybe they give us security. In fact, they probably don't, but this is something that needs to be talked about more. They probably don't because, yeah, you can go around and muscle yourself around the world and say, I've got them on the aircraft carriers, I've got them on the planes, and I've got them in the submarines. But are you going to use them? Right. And if you do use them, what happens? So are they real power? And don't they attract bad feelings to the United States? Is there, I suggest in my book, and it's probably too short of a conversation to go there now, but is there an indirect link even between the way we have behaved in successive wars, where there's always been talk by some crazy guy in the military that we should use nuclear weapons? That, if you look into it far enough, you'll see there's always been somebody that says we should do it. To, you know, things that have happened to us that we don't like. I mean, when you walk around and you're the big guy on the block and you use this to project your power, I think there's consequences.
Mm-hmm. And how does, you talked about tying this back to nuclear power through the fuel cycle. This is the anniversary of Fukushima. Mm-hmm. Beyond the relationship between power, nuclear power, and nuclear mm-hmm. weapons, in that context, in that kind of scientific or clinical context, what's the future of nuclear power in the United States? Are we at risk of a Fukushima or Chernobyl here? And what should we do about that?
You know, we're always, first of all, let's go back to what Hannes Alfvén, the Swedish Nobel laureate, said, I think probably back in the 60s or 70s. He said, acts of God are not permitted with nuclear energy. That applies to Fukushima, and that's for sure. But also, acts of human fallibility are not permitted. And I address this in my book because fallibility is evident in any industry, but in nuclear industry, you can't afford to be fallible.
Browns Ferry, 3 Mile Island, Fermi.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's this long list of people, you know, going around with a candle inside nuclear and catching it. That was Browns.
And at Fukushima, yes, there was a tsunami, but there was a human error. The human error was putting the diesel generators in the basements, and then they have a blackout, and then they have a loss of coolant, and then they have a meltdown, multiple meltdowns. You know, I wrote an article shortly after Fukushima at somebody's request about the possibility of accidents in the United States, and I said everybody's obsessed about the possibility of earthquakes in the United States, but remember there's a million different ways that a nuclear accident can happen. These are very, very complex machines. They look clean when you look at them, and you just picture you see the dome and you think that's clean energy. Look underneath the dome. It's very, very complex. Miles and miles of wiring, thick concrete, very complicated machinery and instrumentation. And so a million things can go wrong, and lots of things do in little ways all the time. I read about it every week, you know. And if too many things go wrong, and the industry has never been able to sequence all the things that could, to put all the sequences together that could go wrong, because there's so many of them.
Wow. So what should we do with nuclear power in the last 2 minutes you have here to talk?
Well, I think that we, particularly when we think about overseas, that promoting nuclear power will come with a cost, because you are promoting virtual bomb-making capability when you send technology that way. Mm-hmm. Secondly, in the United States, I think we should go in a different direction. I think that we already are going in a different direction. I mean, the head of Exelon, John Rowe, has said he doesn't want to build another nuclear power plant right now because natural gas prices are so low. Nuclear power is too expensive, he says. It's also dangerous. I don't know how he feels about alternatives. I'm told that, I mean, the way they're going is towards more alternatives. I think the French are going in this direction. The Germans certainly are. I believe that there's indications the Swiss are. Many other countries are. And I don't want to get left behind on that score. I'm not worried about getting left behind on the nuclear thing, because I think it's kind of old world technology in a way. So if we were to say that the 19th century technology, the pre-19th century was coal, 19th century was oil, 20th century was nuclear, 21st century is will be new things.
Wind,
and
biomass.
Reconfiguring the grid is going to be very important.
Smart grids.
Smart grids, and our choices of energy will determine a lot about how we configure the grid. So that's something to think about. But I think that we should look, and the reason I wrote this book, apart from getting this discussion about weapons going, is to look at all of nuclear's dangers. Safety, proliferation, waste. We still have no place to put waste, although hopefully we're moving towards a solution. And when you couple all this with human fallibility and very, very complicated technology, you have a recipe for disaster.
So let's start the discussion. Stephanie, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
To watch this conversation again, as well as other conversations with great minds, go to our website, conversationswithgreatminds.com.